As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Unless you've been living under a rock for the past few years, if not longer, you would have noticed that there has been a rightward shift in British politics. I've spoken previously on this nebulous category that is the white working class. And this has been weaponized by the right as if to say that the operative term in that phrase, white, is a cause of disadvantage for some people, when we know that's not the case. So joining me today, I have Aurelien with me to kind of unpack the state of affairs in British politics. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So let's go straight into it. My first question is, how have we got to where we are today in terms of British politics?
Well, yeah, that's a huge question to start with. I mean, how long do we have, right? Look, I could talk about this all day. It's been a long process, and I think it's quite important to think about it as a long process because we tend to think about the rise of a far right, the rise of a concept of a white working class as something fairly recent. Usually we think about it in relation to Brexit or to Trump, and 2016 being this kind of core moment. But in fact, it's been a long time coming, and it's not just the rise of the far right. It's not just the rise of Nigel Farage, Donald Trump. It's also the way, the left, the center left, the way they've abandoned left-wing politics, the way they've abandoned the working class, and the way then they woke up to the concept of the working class again. But that stage, this concept had been hijacked by the far right. And I'm trying to be precise here by saying the concept has been hijacked by the far right. It's not the working class itself that was hijacked and that became turned to the far right. It's very much a concept. If we look at it, in this kind of broader kind of time frame, we can see that the far right kind of in various countries, and of course it's not linear and it's very dependent on context. But if you think of the case of France, for example, but also the UK to some extent, although less successfully, the far right started turning to the working class in the 90s, 2000s, and increasingly in the 2000s and 2010s when they saw that the left had abandoned the field, partly because they had decided to move more towards the center, and with kind of more left-wing parties and even communist parties getting in coalition with center-left parties and sometimes even center-right parties, and moving towards kind of neoliberal politics, or accepting at least the neoliberal hegemony. And what happened is you have this you have a deindustrialization, which of course leads to a lot of poverty, leads to a lot of discontentment, leads to a lot of kind of feeling of disillusion as well. But what is fascinating, I think, in this is that for quite a while, and in various countries, the kind of working class that was attached to the left, and particularly to the radical left, communist parties and socialist parties, they don't turn to the far right. The people who turn to the far right in the 2000s or in the 90s, even 2000s and 2010s, for example, in France, where there's a real kind of far right push to kind of absorbing the far right vote, it's actually the working class vote. Sorry, it's actually the new working class. It's the children of the people who used to vote socialist, communist, who used to work in factories. And so it's the people who, if you want, have never been socialized within these factories. They're not socialized in the working class the way the people who were part of unions or the people who were part of kind of factory communities were. So it's the people who have not had this kind of political outlet, if you want. So it's the people who have been cut off. And so that's how the Front National tried to claim the working class. And in fact, it was really a dodgy claim. And it's pretty frustrating that it's been lapped up by the media and by politicians, because what happens is the working class completely switches off, and for good reasons, right? They're not being represented by the left anymore. They're certainly not represented by the far right. And I think it's incredibly condescending to think that the far right, that the working class buys the fact that the far right, which for a long time has been very neoliberal, which is incredibly elitist as well, which doesn't like workers, but the far right would be their defenders all of a sudden. And so there is a section of the far right, a section of the working class, that turns to the far right, but it's small. It's always existed. It's nothing entirely new. And what we forget is that most of the working class abstains, doesn't turn up anymore. And it's incredibly frustrating to then, you get to the point where the narrative is, well, the working class is turning to the far right, and you get to the point where the media is talking about it, and you get to the point eventually where the centre-left parties like the Labour Party in the UK, the Parti Socialiste, or even the Communist Party in France buy into that, and they all try to tap into this kind of working class that votes to the far right, which is 1 out of 10 of the working class people, but that's enough to kind of push that narrative. And so instead of focusing on actually working class issues such as employment, education, pensions, all of these kind of things, they
Yep.
start focusing on immigration, they start focusing on so-called cultural grievances, on Islam in particular,
Yep.
maybe more in France than it is in the UK, and all of this. And it's, it's incredibly frustrating because you see these kind of left-wing parties fighting for one tenth of the working class, while 9/10 is, well, a big chunk is still voting for the left, and the rest is completely abandoned. And of course, that leads to the racialization of the working class, because the working class that they are creating and fighting for is not any kind of working class. It's a far right working class, or it's a
Yep.
working class that votes for the far right, but it's a far right that is defined by its whiteness, not by its class anymore.
Exactly.
And that kind of course, naturalizes the fact that the far right is white, the far right is reactionary, and if only we didn't have, the working class is white, the working class is reactionary, and if only we didn't have a working class, we could have, liberalism. And of course, it's,
But the question then is, so when you see what happened to Jeremy Corbyn and decimation and the continued decimation of Labour, when we see Brexit, are strategically, isn't it then a strategic move to see that the currents maybe are rejecting hard left policies, are rejecting left wing politics? Isn't the natural trajectory for, like, let's say, centre left parties like Labour, or even, I feel like if I say his name, I might see the devil appear. But when Tony Blair comes on TV and he says that, Labour can't win being that left, Labour has to be in the centre, Labour has to work with unions, but also work with business to win. That's the only way Labour wins. So when you see that, is that not strategically a smart move for those centre-left parties like Labour?
well, yeah, but I mean, in that case, right? It's exactly the same as the Republicans thinking, Trump will never win. Let's not have him, right? Or Boris Johnson is too much of a clown and he's been saying too many racist things, and too
Yep.
many lies. He'll never be prime minister. They just had a message that kind of carried across. And of course, it's a massive uphill battle for the left, right? Whether
Yeah.
the left is being moderate and neoliberal and aping the right or far right, or whether the left is being radical, it's going to be an uphill battle, right? And you see that Starmer is not doing very well at all, trying to kind of play the game and the kind of Blairist game in a way. I
Yep.
think the uphill battle is of course, there's a big problem with the media and media ownership in this country, and concentration and all of this, which is completely skewed against Labour. But it's also creating a new narrative. And I think what I do not understand in the claims of the left needing to be a bit more kind of cunning and a bit more have a better strategy and be a bit more kind of compromising in terms of values if they want to get back into power and all of these kind of things, is that it's never worked. When the left has moved rightwards, it sometimes worked in the very short term. It never worked in the mid to long term. And you can look
Wow.
at various cases when the left starts fighting on the ideological grounds of the right and far right, when it's about immigration, security, terrorism, all these things, it does not work. And of course it doesn't work, because actually it naturalizes the issues that the right is not good at. Actually, they're not even good at it, but they own, if you want. This
Yes.
is their issues. And also what that does is that it alienates a big chunk of supporters. And look,
Yep.
I am not a Corbyn supporter in any way, and I had many issues with the way he went about his leadership. But I think
Yeah.
you have to give that to him, that he actually brought in quite a few people back to
Yep.
politics. Whether young people, and also he did not alienate some of the people who I fear will be alienated from the Labour Party soon. I mean, when you see this kind of calls from Starmer and his team to kind of have more flags, to focus more on
Exactly.
patriotism, like to we see calls returning about being tougher on immigration, closing borders. This is shocking. I mean, imagine
Yeah.
if you're from an ethnic minority and part of a
Yep.
working class, are you really going to kind of put up with that? And the sad thing is, you probably will, and you probably will end up voting for Starmer because there's nothing else, and that's what they're counting on. But I think it's unfair, and I think it's not democratic, and I think the left needs to be radical, as the right is radical at the moment. They need to completely shift the discourse and the hegemony. It's super hard work, and it will take a long time, and it will be difficult, and it's an uphill battle with the way the kind of ecosystem is at the moment. But this is exactly what the far right started doing in the 1970s and 80s. And look at where
Yeah.
we are now, right? At the beginning, they were like,
Absolutely.
we need to fight the cultural battle before the political one. We need to impose our ideas. and now their ideas are front, right, and center, right? Yeah. So it's
No, absolutely. No, thank you so much. I was speaking to someone I consider like a teacher, and he said to me, I think, and exactly echoing what you said, that the left doesn't have a 40, 50-year plan. And because of we're not radical enough, because we're always thinking about election to next election, we always settle for crumbs. So we're settling for the lesser of two evils always. We're holding our nose when we go to vote. When the right, as you correctly said, you can say Brexit was started from the 70s. It's been a long time coming. So I think it's very important. I think if I'm looking at the situation, I would say that if we're going to win, it's going to be an upward battle, but we've got to think about, okay, what's our 30 to 40-year plan? But again, I guess it's easy for us, or easy for myself to say in theory, when obviously people's conditions and material conditions are becoming worse and worse day by day.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, right? And what I'm saying is, like, I'm not trying to be, utopian or idealistic
Yeah.
and say, let's fight in a small corner and, for 40 years, and then maybe things will change and, we'll get some utopia at the end. This is not what I'm saying. I think daily battles need to be fought, but daily battles are fought, but they're not fought by the Labour Party at the moment, right?
Yep.
These daily battles are fought by grassroots movements. If we've had progress in recent years, or if we had at least resistance to reaction in recent years, it's been through grassroots movements. I mean, look at BLM, for example.
Yep.
Look at the various strikes that are taking place in not just in the UK, in other places. This is not led by Labour and its allies anymore. And so I think, it's not one or the other. I think, in fact, you could fight these two fights together, creating some kind of positive project on the left that doesn't play on the turf of the right or far right, because that's a lost battle, and fight on a day-to-day basis to make sure that, people, that we safeguard whatever we can at this stage. But the Labour Party at the moment is not doing either. And I just cannot. I mean, it's always fascinating to me, because when I talk to colleagues about this in particular, I mean, I'm nominally, well, I'm in a politics department or a political science department, so I guess I'm nominally a political scientist. It's not a term that is particularly dear to me, but but when I talk to my colleagues, they tend to think that, I'm too radical, I'm too passionate about politics, I'm too potentially normative in my approach to academia and so on. And, this is like the book we wrote with Aaron Winter. We made it very clear that we were taking a stand on it, and that we believe that this was the best way for us to be impartial, was to acknowledge where we were coming from politically, and that we had a responsibility to do that as well. And what I find fascinating is when I talk to colleagues is they dismiss my ideas sometimes as being too idealistic almost. But to me, it seems like the idealism it's not even idealism. There is a massive denial in thinking that something that has failed for 30 or 40 years is eventually going to succeed, because that's what you think is rational and moderate. I mean, the path that the left has followed for the last 30 or 40 years has led us to where we are now. I mean, we can't just blame the right. Tony Blair has paved that way. François Mitterrand in France has paved that way. Gerhard Schröder in Germany has paved that way. The Clintons paved that way in the US, the way to Trump. And Biden is not doing all he should be doing to kind of revert that.
We can talk about Biden. I feel like he was the person when I said you have to hold your nose and vote for him. That's what I meant.
I could think of many people like this, but yeah. but that's a good one. And actually, literally, right? Like, the first time I ever voted was in 2002. That was the first election I could vote. In France. And so, I had the 2 rounds of a presidential election, and if your listeners don't know what happened, this is the time when Jean-Marie Le Pen of a far-right Front National, a Holocaust denier, got to the second round of a presidential election. And in the first round, so what happened is there was massive abstention in the first round, because we had a coalition between the center-right and the center-left. No one liked them, the 2 center-right and center-left candidates, so no one wanted to vote for them. And we'd been told that they would get to the second round anyway. I was worried. It was nothing like prophetic or anything like that, but I was worried that Jean-Marie Le Pen might get through because everyone would abstain. And so I decided to vote for the Socialist Party, the center-left party, who I really disliked in the first round. So I totally wasted my
Why did you dislike them? Why did you dislike them?
Because they were just so kind of like unmotivating. They were so middle of the road. They, it's just, they were just. The left had betrayed, the Socialist Party had betrayed the left in 1983. So François Mitterrand had been elected in 1981 on a very radical agenda. Then in 1983, austerity kicked in, neoliberalization, the rise of the Front National to try to divide the right, lots of things that have happened. And, I don't think it's necessarily of interest here. But anyway, so I get to 2002. I don't want to vote for them. I wanted to vote for something more radical.
Yes.
And I didn't, because I thought, just in case, I could help him get through at least, and it's not the Front National. And then the Front National gets through, and then I'm faced in the second round to vote between the Front National, so a former fascist, who
Wow.
probably was still a fascist, right, Holocaust denier and all that, or the center-right candidate who had many corruption scandals around him, and if he got elected, would probably escape them because eventually, you can't get sued anymore. Eventually, it's
Yeah.
and so you had that choice, and French people had that choice, and some people literally went voting with gloves, with pegs on their noses, with just to make a point, right? So it takes us back to what you were saying before, and actually it happened literally in France, where people went to vote between the bad and the worst, and it's like
Bad than the worst. What's the voting age in France? I'm going to do some maths here.
18.
18. So 2002, that was your first vote. I'm not going to guess your age, but the reason why I'm asking this question, this is what a lot of young people want to hear, and they hear this from people who are older. The older you get, the more centrist you become. Has that been the case for you?
No. Well, yeah, I don't know. Look, yeah, maybe I'm still young then in that case. No, it hasn't been the case for me, actually. But interestingly, it really hasn't. And I think it's because I've been very lucky, and I've met the right people along the way. Or I hope I did anyway. But no, I haven't. I mean, when I was 18, 20, I was very much a social democrat.
Okay.
Yeah. So I didn't vote for the Socialist Party, but I wasn't thoroughly against them. I was hoping that they were redeemable, and I was hoping that they would kind of, revive. And I took part in kind of center-left politics when I was younger, and all of these things. And I wouldn't touch it anymore, because I don't believe that. I don't believe that's the solution to our current predicament. And also, I believe that the center-left has been incredibly counterproductive in the 20 years that I've had of political activity, let's say, since I'm an adult, which of course is limiting, because I don't think you should just be politically engaged when you turn 18 or whatever age it is, right? So no, that's not been my trajectory at all. And since then, I mean, since 2002, which was the first time I voted, I've always had a very difficult relationship with elections and voting, because it was very scaring to vote both rounds for options you didn't want, in a way.
Exactly.
And this shouldn't be democracy, right?
But then, okay, so then sometimes people will say, I mean, you laid out that the white working class have been abandoned, and the majority are actually not far right. Some people will say, and this is maybe my reading of history, it might not apply to the European context, but I think definitely if we look in America, that all too often when we think of white working class people, it does seem like they choose race solidarity over class solidarity a lot of the time.
Well, I mean, what I said is, I didn't say that the white working class had been abandoned. I said the working class had been abandoned. I think one of the things that's very important to think of when we think about the working class is that the working class is the most diverse section of a society, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you think about European countries, for example, the people who came to rebuild France, the UK, and various other countries after the Second World War were people from the former colonies, or colonies at the time, obviously. And they were very much the kind of core of the working class. And to some extent, they still are as well. So I think we need to remember that the working class is incredibly diverse, and far more diverse than the people who run our media or run our politics or our private schools and so on. So I think that's the first thing to remember. In terms of kind of choosing kind of race interests over class interests, I mean, this is fascinating. And again, these are long trajectories, and it's happened on a number of occasions. And if you look at the history of the United States, there's some very, and again, it's not necessarily my direct area of expertise, particularly the historical side of things in the US, but there are some interesting cases there of actually, the real attempt to divide the working class and working class solidarities between the former kind of slaves who had been emancipated and, for example, the white working class at the time, to kind of try and kind of keep this kind of segregation so that the working class wouldn't be united against the people oppressing them. And so, this is again nothing new, and this is exactly what's happening at the moment when the far right is trying to appeal to the working class or to the so-called white working class. It's divide and conquer, because if this working class, whether you're white or not, you have far more in common with each other than you have with Marine Le Pen or with Nigel Farage or with Donald Trump. I mean, that photo of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage in that golden elevator is fascinating to me, right? And but if you look,
the golden calf,
right? Yeah. But if you look at figures as well, I mean, that's what frustrates me about it all is, we've seen so much written about the white working class. There are so many headlines, and I collected them for a while as part of my research, and like so many headlines in including in liberal and center-left and left-wing outlets that were saying, we need to regain the white working class, we need to fight for the white working class. The white working class has turned to Trump, to Brexit, to Farage, whatever. It's just simply not true. It is not
Hmm.
true. Basic electoral data shows you it is not true, or it's not that simple. Again, not saying that some of the working class didn't turn to the far right, but that's nothing new. But the majority didn't. And not only that, the
Okay.
majority of the vote for Trump or for Brexit comes from wealthier parts of society. So,
Exactly. So okay. So do you think then? I'm actually an optimist, and my position has always been of working towards a multiracial solidarity. Do you think that's still possible?
absolutely, yeah. I mean, of course, it is possible, and well, maybe I want to kind of like be an optimist as well. But if look, what would we do if we weren't optimistic about the fact that these kind of things are possible? I think they are, because they actually make sense completely. And certain interests have been working so hard to create these divisions,
Yep.
and yet you see this solidarity on a daily basis in lots of different places. I mean, one of the things that gives me hope in what I'm working on at the moment, and I've been touching on this particular survey for a while in my research, and I'm working on it a bit more precisely to kind of look at the creation of the people in my recent research, is when people are asked in a number of surveys, we keep hearing, immigration is a major concern for people and
Yeah.
so on, right? I'm sure you've seen headlines like this. When you look at surveys that ask these questions, what are the biggest concerns, according to you in the UK at the moment, or something like
Yeah.
this, people say immigration. They rarely put it at the top. They usually put it second, third, sometimes at the top, sometimes mostly in the UK at the top, partly in 2016, and then it fizzles out. So it's not even
Yeah.
always the major concern. But one of the surveys that I looked at, the Eurobarometer, actually asks the same people two questions. So the one is, according to you, what are the two biggest issues facing your country at the moment? And then they
Hmm.
given 15 different things, to choose from. So education, pensions, immigration, terrorism, whatever, right? And they have to pick two.
Yeah.
And then the same people, they ask them the same question, except it's, according to you, what are the two biggest issues you are facing at the moment? So the
Wow.
same people ask the two questions, your country and you personally. And
Hmm.
when people are asked, according to your country, immigration is quite high. It's
Hmm.
top once, I think, in the last 10 years, which is just during the referendum campaign. But when the same people are asked about their personal life, immigration hardly rates. It's like at the
Wow.
bottom. It's 13th or 5th or 14th. Instead you have cost of living, education, pensions and things like that. So what does that say to us, right? Well, it says that we could have better headlines. We have the same survey here that tells us two very different messages. Why do we promote one and not the other? It doesn't necessarily say that people don't care about immigration personally, but it shows that they have other concerns, and it shows that different discourses could be created, different narratives could be created, and that if we created these different narratives, then we would have a very different society. Because I don't think it takes a genius to realize that our knowledge of society beyond our closest friends and family is mediated.
Yes.
You don't know most of the people in the city you live in, let alone in the country
Exactly.
you live in, or the continent, or whatever, right? So when you
Hmm.
go and vote, you have to rely on some form of mediated knowledge, whether it's through your kind of religious community, or whether it's through
Hmm.
your trade union, your factory, your workplace, and quite often the media, of course, right?
Yes.
And of course, the media doesn't tell you things that you believe automatically, but it does set the agenda. So if we talk a
Of
lot
course.
about immigration, when you go to vote, you'll be thinking about immigration. You might not be anti-immigrant, but you'll be thinking it's still an issue, right? But when you think
Hmm.
about yourself and your day-to-day life, you don't need this mediated knowledge, or not as much.
Yes.
You'll be worried about sending your kids to school, or you'll be worried about your pension coming in, or you'll be worried about whether you're going to have a job in a month, or something like that.
Hmm.
And again, this is fairly obvious, this kind of mediated knowledge. And nowadays, there's been a lot of research that has shown that the mediated knowledge that we acquire through the media in particular, which still is one of the biggest influences in the way we make decisions about politics, well, it's massively skewed. So, for example, during the Brexit referendum, even though the economy was the topic the most talked about during the campaign in the media, and that was shown by some colleagues at King's College who did an amazing survey on this,
Hmm.
immigration was the second most discussed issue in the media, but that was also the issue that was the most prominent in headlines, and it was
Yep.
generally done in a negative manner. And so, of course,
Mm.
this influences the way people, think about these things. And, you could think about the same thing about about Islam in France, for example, or even
Yes.
Islam in the UK. In France, when people are asked out of 100 people, how many do you think are Muslim? They said in 2016, they said 31%. In
Yes. Wow.
2016, when they were asked in 2020, how many do you think will be Muslim? They said 42%. It's mad, right? Like 4 out of 10 people in France are Muslim in 2020. It's completely mad. Do you know what the reality is?
No, what is it?
7 or 8%.
Wow.
So it's like people thought there were 4 times more Muslim people than there really are. And
Wow.
when then the people who did the survey, they asked the respondents, they said, when I tell you Muslim people, what do you think about? And of course, people had very negative images of
Of
Muslim
course.
people. They thought about the Muslim people they see on TV. They think about the Muslim people they see on the news. And, these Muslim people generally are terrorists,
Yeah.
and in France, it's people who don't want to integrate, or so-called people who don't want to integrate, and so on. So, but of course, they don't think about the Muslim people as in the neighbor who's Muslim. He's a good friend, and he takes my children to school sometimes, or he lent me his tools or whatever. But it's not them. He's not a problem. The problem is the Muslim. And I'm doing scare quotes here, like quotation marks.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating the way the discourses that are built. And of course, what's interesting in this then is that then it allows our elite, whether it's our media elite, our political elite, to some extent our academics as well, to blame the rise of reactionary ideas onto the people, even though these ideas are kind of like to some extent created, or at least put out there by the people who control public discourse. They then blame the people for them. So they're like, if we talk about immigration, it's because that's what the people want. But is it what the people want, or is it what the people are told is what they want?
Exactly.
Chicken or the egg, right? And it's not one or the other. It's a bit of both. The people have agency. But I think we tend to forget far too often that some people have far more impact on public discourse than others.
Exactly. So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about cancel culture. What is your take on cancel culture? Because a lot of the time I'm hearing, as you just said, people have agency and people should be able to make decisions for themselves. And the whole liberal kind of way of doing things, the liberal schema is we have to just normalize ideas. We have to, have healthy debate. Any functioning democracy allows difference of opinion. And then the left is, then accused by the right of saying, no, you lot are very repressive in your outlook. You want to cancel people. You want to stifle debate. What would be your response, and where do you kind of sit with that whole discussion?
Well, look, I feel like I'm cancelled myself. I've never had a tribune in any major newspaper in the UK. So I think it's just unfair, and I think I should have one, and I think you should have one as well. I think you and I should create a union or something like that.
Let's do it.
Look, it's ridiculous, right? And some colleagues have written about it incredibly well to show how ridiculous the whole thing is. One of the things that I was reading about very recently, and again showing that these things are nothing new. The things that we have at the moment about cancel culture are the same things that people were talking about, 30, 40, 50 years ago, when they were talking about political correctness, or when they were talking about no platforming, for example. Evan Smith wrote a great book on no platforming in universities in the UK, and how it was a moral panic, 40 years ago, and now it's back.
Yeah.
But what I was reading about very recently as well is the idea of a marketplace of ideas, and it's something that has been used a lot by some, what we call with Aaron, reactionary legitimizers.
Mm-hmm.
And, this idea of marketplace of ideas, which is like, every idea should be debated, and the best ideas will prevail, and, if there's a bad idea, put it in the sunlight and it will disappear. Of course, as if that ever was true, right? Because, if that was the case, we probably wouldn't have had Nazism or fascism or racism and so on and so forth. But I think what's fascinating about the marketplace of idea is I don't know if it's denial or if it's just people having no ethics at all, is that it's never worked. And it's obvious that even in the marketplace, in the normal marketplace, it's not necessarily the best products that win. It's also dependent on how much money you can invest in the product itself, in the advertising, in cornering the market, and all of these kind of things. And, in terms of ideas, it is very clear that some people have far more power to put their ideas out there than others. Look at Donald Trump, for example, and his followers on Twitter. He could say something that was completely untrue, but he was saying that to millions of people. Well, an academic would say, in the US would correct him, but they had 2,000 followers, right? Look at me. I have a few thousand followers on Twitter compared to some of my colleagues who would say the opposite of what I'm saying to 200,000 people. You know, yes, of course I have the right to say whatever I want, but it's not an even playing field. So I'm all for, like, I think free speech is a beautiful idea, but then give us even speech as well, and which we don't have. We don't all speak from the same position. And again, if you look at the debates at the moment on free speech, and how it's like,
especially in universities.
yeah, well, yeah, in universities, but not even in activist circles. If you look at it, the way people feel like, the people who tell you they can't say anything anymore are the people who are transphobic, who are homophobic, who are racist, all these kind of people. But these people are always in positions of power. What I find fascinating is, again, to go back to the French case, which has set the trend in a number of ways. But for the last 30, well, actually, since 1985 and maybe even longer, but in 1985, there was a front page in a right-wing magazine, Le Figaro magazine, that said, "Will we still be French in 30 years?" And there was a Marianne, the symbol of French, with a hijab. That was 30 years ago. Since then, we've had every magazine in France who have said the taboo about Islam, we can't talk about Islam, political correctness gone mad and all that. But that's all we do in France. We only talk about Islam in the media all the time. And the only people who cannot talk about Islam are Muslim people. We never listen to Muslim people in France. It's incredible. So, for example, when the law of 2004 against the hijab in schools was passed, no Muslim girl or women were wearing a hijab was interviewed. So I mean, that's fascinating, right? And the hypocrisy behind all of this is mind-blowing. And what frustrates me again is that people who should know better fall for it. So what's been interesting me really in my research is not just the far right and reactionaries and racists, but it's how they've been enabled by people who should know better and people who pretend that they're against these ideas and yet fall for their tricks so easily, and people who benefit from that obviously as well.
And again, it's so, for me, I feel like I'm living in, as Baudrillard says, a simulacra. Because I'm thinking to myself, people like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson talking about being cancelled. I'm thinking, you have over 1 million followers on your social media accounts. Which part of you is cancelled? Yes, you might have had a protest take place at where you're due to speak, but you are, for all intents and purposes, still have a massive platform and still have fundings. I don't understand how they can even say they're cancelled.
But I think one of the things that's incredibly funny about these people, I mean, it's funny, but they're also dangerous, obviously. But what's funny about them is that they are the same people who popularized, the terms snowflakes, social justice warrior. But these people are incredibly thin-skinned. So if you disagree with them, they'll tell you that you're cancelling them, and it's quite incredible. I mean, these people who are banging on about free speech are the first one to threaten to sue others if they criticize them. I mean, we get the same thing in the UK as well, with some prominent kind of reactionary academics threaten to sue other people for writing long, well-detailed, well-researched expose on how rubbish their ideas are. It happens all the time, but how thin-skinned they are is fascinating to me. I mean, again, and I think that kind of cowardly stance of these people knowing full well that they have a lot to lose if we had more equal societies, and then they take that cowardly stance of fighting tooth and nail to protect this kind of unfair, unwarranted privilege that they have.
Exactly.
And I think the problem again is not so much them, because I think their ideas don't have a lot of echo in the wider society. What the problem is, they are being hyped, they are being given far too much coverage, and people are falling for it. And I think, again, what really, really frustrates me is the people who should know better, who are falling for it and giving these people platforms and giving these people attention and giving these people more credit than they deserve, and not giving the others the credit they deserve as well. I think what's shocking is that falling for this idea of cancel culture is you actually never give voice to the people who are being attacked and who are at the sharp end of racism, transphobia, homophobia, sexism, and so on.
Exactly. And then finally, when we're talking about the UK, we see right now, as always, when America sneezes, Britain catches the cold. We find that there's been this campaign now against cultural Marxism, or CRT is a Marxist ideology. What is up with that? Is it just the kind of typical anti-Cold War rhetoric, or the anti-kind of Soviet Union rhetoric just being reproduced, or something more than that?
Well, to some extent, I mean, look, it's always the same old moral panics with different names and different kind of terms used. I mean, again, I just find it fascinating. It's like, look, if anyone really believes in cultural Marxism, overtaking our universities, come and spend a day in my department and you'll see that. It's not that radical, really. And I think, my department is probably very similar to any politics department in the country. So, this is quite incredible how disconnected these people are from reality. And yet again, the platforms they get, not just in the media, but they have the ear of a government now. They have direct contact with number 10. It's incredibly worrying, I think, how we've let reactionaries access power, and proper reactionaries, who have made their way into power now, and how we still, and when I say we, I'm talking about we as in the people who, again, have access to public discourse to some extent, and or more access to public discourse than the rest of the population. Is they've been allowed to do that, and they're still allowed to do that far too much. I think it's we need to fight back, because they are actually not holding their punches anymore. And yet we're still playing by their rules as if it was just a nice apolitical debate, and the truth will prevail.
I mean, absolutely finally. I know we said we're both optimists, but everything you said for the last 20 minutes sounds like such a bleak situation that we find ourselves in. So what can we do going forward? What would you say is, you're a political theorist. I know you don't want to be called that, but going forward, if you, let's say, had the ear of activists or organizers or people on the left, what would you be telling them?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I spent the last 15 years now looking at the far right, and looking at the mainstreaming of the far right and mainstreaming of far right ideas. So, I spent a lot of my time mapping out the rise of reaction, and I got a bit tired of it, to be honest, because it does take a toll, and things are not getting any better. So I thought, like, maybe it's time for me to try and write something a bit different, and something a bit more not necessarily optimistic, but a bit more affirmative in a way, instead of mapping. And so that's my next project, in a way. I mean, where I find some kind of solace, if not optimism, and probably optimism, I think, is in the very simple fact that things do not have to be this way, right? It's all contingent, and nothing says that the world should be as it is, that we should have the inequalities that we have, that we should have the poverty that we have, that we should have the racism that we have at the core of our institutions, or anything like that. This is not written in stone. This is not something that has always existed in human societies, and this is not something that will always exist. And it could get a lot worse. It could get a lot better. It doesn't. It just simply doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy to change these things, but it can be done. And look, I mean, what weirdly gives me hope in change is that the far right has managed to kind of change the narrative massively over the last 40 years, and if they could do it with their stupid ideas, I think we should as well. But I think we need to be far less apologetic about what we believe in, and I think we need to be more hopeful, and we need to stop reacting. I think we can't just keep reacting to the far right. We need, of course, to resist. We need to be on the ground against fascists, against reactionary, to help the communities who are at the sharp end. This is very, very important, but we need to go beyond that. We can't just be reacting. We also need to be acting. We also need to be proposing something that is hopeful, that is optimistic, that is radical, and that is radically different to what is sending us in the wall, whether it's with regard to the rise of fascism, the environmental crisis, and various other crises that we are facing, and real ones, as opposed to the kind of moral panics that the far right and the right are trying to divert our attention onto.
That was a beautiful, beautiful ending. Thank you so much. You are listening to The Malcolm Effect with Mamadou. Please like, comment, subscribe. I will leave Dr. Aurelien's social media in the description of this episode. Please feel free to follow him. He posts a lot of great content on Twitter. Take care until next time.